Together, we work as one for better LGBTIQ lives. Outright.
Okay, we're going to kick off this session about decriminalization. I'm Maria Shedin. I'm the Executive Director of Outright International. And with me on this panel, I have three amazing colleagues. Rosanna Flemmer Caldera, the Executive Director of the oldest Sri Lankan LGBT organization, Equal Ground. Kenita Placid, the Executive Director of the regional organization ECADE, the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality. And Friedel Dausa, with Positive Vibes Namibia, the Diversity Alliance of Namibia, and also a litigant in a decriminalization case. So we're going to examine the importance of decriminalization and some of the strategies being used, and talk about the importance of it throughout this panel. And so, Kenita, I'll start with you. As the Executive Director of ECADE, you have been working on strategic litigation to overturn the so-called buggery laws in multiple Caribbean countries, with recent positive rulings in two of the countries, Antigua and Barbuda and St. Kitts and Nevis. So can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to pursue strategic litigation, what other options were on the table, like penal code reform, and, given that you have achieved two positive rulings so far, how do you feel about this choice as an effective way of creating change?
That sounds like a loaded gun. That's many things. But just looking at ECADE, the formation of ECADE came through a consultation with organizations across the Eastern Caribbean, which we are working with. And so when I speak about Eastern Caribbean, we normally would say OECS and Barbados, but I can break down that further. Saying OECS actually refers to politically 6 countries, independent countries. It has 3 additional territories. But let's speak to the independent countries. Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, Commonwealth of Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. These are the actual 6 countries in the OECS, and Barbados. Barbados feels like an and very often. So saying Eastern Caribbean, just inclusive of everything. So having LGBT organizations or representatives from each of those countries come into one meeting in 2015, speaking about what can we do? What would you like to be seen done in this region? And this is on the heels of being the executive director of United and Strong and having the portfolio as the Eastern Caribbean Hub Coordinator for Carry Flags, which is the Caribbean Forum for Liberation and Acceptance of Genders and Sexualities. So this is really where a lot of the regional organizing started. And because Carry Flags was not sure what was going to happen to this hub, we had this meeting to say, let's discuss how we want to self-organize. At this meeting, organizations came through speaking about what their needs were, but what we can do as a region. This then called for an independent organization that would actually work with everybody to bring the very first priority was bringing funding to the region. Second priority was increasing research. And then we had things we can do in the region, which was looking at capacity building, providing governance support, and litigation. With litigation, it took off first, obviously, having a number of lawyers in the room who had an invested interest in this. We also invited international partners like the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. We were in conversations with Outright. We had Human Dignity Trust, all at that table, feeding in as they were already doing small bits of work in different countries. How can we bring all of this under an umbrella and understand what's going on? So right there, that mandate for litigation took, it went on a fast track. we saw the interest in funders to be able to bring litigation to the forefront. I saw an opportunity to mobilize and build community. And so bringing those things together, leaving United and Strong in March of 2016, gave birth to ECADE June of 2016. And from since then, we had been building the strategy. First things we did was actually lessons learned. What was the lessons we learned from the Belize case, which was filed since 2010? What was the lessons learned from India's case, from Kenya, from what was happening in Uganda? So we actually did the research on who was doing what and how was those things being moved forward. So we developed a roadmap, first of all, a roadmap which mapped out what all the organizations needed. We also looked at different things as United and Strong back in St. Lucia. What was I involved in? Things like the United Nations, things like the OS, things like constitutional reform, engagement with parliamentarians and ministers at different levels. And we looked at all the different individuals who were involved with organizations. What was their capacity to also do the same? Where constitution reforms were happening, how can we submit? Where can we get local organizations to step up? Structures were different, accessibility was different, visibility was different. And the one thing that all organizations at the time in 2016 cried for was the fact that if we had 9 organizations actively working, there were only 2 of them with actual safe spaces. And even those that had the offices still did not have paid staff. It was volunteer. I ran United and Strong for 10 years, 2006 to 2016. I have never been a paid staff of United and Strong. Many people don't know that because they just see me all over the place. But I leverage opportunities from Outright and ILGA, and even being with Carry Flags, which was the first paid job in 2013, to leverage the visibility of United and Strong. And even then, when I became a member of the Outright team in 2016, it gave an opportunity to then actually Outright helped pushed get ECADE registered. It also helped with getting an organization in Antigua registered. Back then, we got one in Belize as well as Transwave in Jamaica. So this was like building that strategy for the Eastern Caribbean, but still connecting the dots to the wider Caribbean. So this is where the strategy came about in terms of we are going towards litigation because we would not get any government to touch that burglary law to say it's moving in a hurry.
Thank you so much. And thanks for explaining that it's not just one thing, that it's a whole web of activities that have led to the situation. Friedel, I'm going to go to you next. So in Southern Africa, we have seen decriminalization come about both through strategic litigation in Botswana and legal reforms, for example, in the Lusophone countries, so Angola, Mozambique, and Lesotho. So what kind of consensus did you have in Namibia among activists that strategic litigation was the best way forward? And what's the timeline and anticipated results from your case?
Thanks, Maria. Good day to everyone. Our case really in Namibia was also hinged really very much on what was happening throughout the world. We had this global decrim conference in Swakopmund, where we actually had cases that Kenita was just speaking about, the Belize case, etc. It had really just happened after the organizations in Namibia most of them joined the network called the Diversity Alliance of Namibia, which really cleared the way for collaborative engagement and advocacy. I think before that, Many of the organizations were responding to emergencies. So the public health emergency of HIV among trans and gay men and bisexual men, or the GBV crisis among women, or the impunity with which the police were treating sex workers. And so the Diversity Alliance really brought together feminist women's organizations, LGBTIQ+ organizations, as well as sex worker organizations for national strategy. And so after this global Decrim conference, we went back and consulted nationally and came up with what we call the road to recognition. Oh, no, we wanted to call it the road to recognition, and then the activists decided the road to reclamation, because we didn't seek recognitions, we were seeking to reclaim our rights that are promised by the Constitution. At that meeting, a three-pronged approach was agreed on. So one was the parliamentary avenue to overturn the punitive laws through parliamentary action. The other one was litigation, strategic litigation, to use the court system to overturn these unfair, unjust laws. And importantly, the community engagement strategy, which would ensure that I think when Steve was speaking from South Africa, we know, for example, in Namibia that, you know, South Africa changed their laws right after independence, but there was not really a lot of community engagement. And we're trying to avoid a place where we change the laws in vacuum and our communities are left behind and we still sit with a lot of violence that is perpetrated. And so the third strategy really is to speak to traditional leaders, speak to religious leaders, speak to key gatekeepers and opinion makers to ensure that people do understand that LGBT rights are human rights and they need to be respected as such. My case, which happened in June this year, is not really the first action. The first action really happened because maybe explain it a little, Namibia situation a little bit. So we gained independence from the then apartheid South Africa 31 years ago in 1991. And when that happened, we inherited all the laws of the apartheid state. And our constitution, which is really brilliant, states that citizens can actually bring to the courts unconstitutional laws to be tested by the Supreme Court, which is also our constitutional court. As part of this, the Ministry of Justice started a project a couple of years ago, which they call the Obsolete Laws Project, and they invited citizens to submit laws that they feel are unconstitutional. The Diversity Alliance, together with Positive Vibes and other partners, did submit for the repeal of the Sodomy Law, as well as a review of the Unnatural Sexual Offences Act that we inherited as a colonial piece of legislation from most of countries that have been colonized by Great Britain. And so that is ongoing. It was submitted to Cabinet. The Cabinet Committee looked at it. As part of what was actually quite strange was that it was not only our submission that was submitted to the Cabinet. There were many other laws, but they did isolate ours. They said all the other laws will be reformed and repealed, but ours, specifically our submission, has been referred to Parliament. And so we are waiting for the parliamentary process to take place. While we are waiting on that, there are other developments, legal developments. So in front of the courts at the moment, we have several cases. So one is litigation on recognition of citizens of two twins of a same-sex couple. One is Namibian, one is Mexican, and they did get twins by surrogacy in South Africa. And so that case is in front of the Supreme Court to get the two twins Namibian citizenship on the basis of the same-sex marriage. We have other domicile cases that are also in front of the Supreme Court. One concluded in South Africa, a Namibian and a South African, who are also asking for recognition of family. And so in order to help these cases that are already in front of the Supreme Court, but also to push Parliament to actually start discussing submission, we decided to put in the sodomy law, because after 30 years, we still have this law. And it's really one of the most basic legislations that needed to go away after independence. And so, so it was decided. So one of the things is that we, as a civil society, wanted to bring the case, but we also have very narrow laws of standing in Namibia. So we can't take any class action as part of our legal framework. We needed someone to raise their hands, and so we scouted around. We didn't really find a lot of people, because you would have to kind of, in a way, admit to the courts that, you know, this law substantively and personally impacts me. I raised my hand, and that's so that we are here. And so it's really a part of a collaborative effort, and it should not be seen as something that's going that is being done alone. So it's really strategic in that it really tries to make sure that the Supreme Court doesn't really, when it's adjudicating the other cases, doesn't look back and say we have a sodomy law and therefore give a negative judgment. But we also wanted to signal to Parliament to tell them that if you do not take your responsibility as the custodians of the Constitution of Namibia, we will seek for change through the courts.
Thank you so much, Friedel, and thank you for explaining again what a collective effort it is. But at the same time, I think we have to all recognize that you raised your hand, and I hope you do feel, and I hope you do have all the backup that you need to be in that position. Rosanna, let me talk to you next. So, I mean, in Sri Lanka, you have so far taken maybe a slightly different approach. I mean, you've taken a case, again, a person who have raised their hand, to take a case to the UN Commission on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, sometimes called CEDAW, while also pursuing other discussions with and engagement with the government. How do you look upon the courts in Sri Lanka? Is that a viable option? And with the CEDAW ruling in hand, what are your next steps?
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, everybody. Really a pleasure to be here in New York after such a long time, COVID having shut us all down. A little bit of history about the laws in Sri Lanka. In 1995, the government passed this, what do you call it, a savings law clause in the Constitution, saying that any law that was not in 1972, actually. It's a bit of a COVID moment for me. So when I just go off into the distance, you know that that's my excuse anyway. I don't know about everybody else. The savings law clause, yeah, this is a thing where any law that was enacted before the constitutional changes in 1972 could not be challenged in a court of law. So we could not take criminalization to the Supreme Court. So as a result of that, I mean, you know, things were just going along. When we formed Equal Ground, we decided that, you know, there had to be a number of changes that happened in Sri Lanka, because up to that point, thanks to the British colonial laws enacted in 1883, we still, like 138 years later, still have these same laws that criminalize consenting same-sex sexual relationships. So we decided that there had to be a lot of education and sensitizing that needed to happen with our own community, because we didn't know how to recognize that we were queer or gay or lesbian or transgender, and with the public at large, because they too do not recognize LGBTIQ persons and don't treat LGBTIQ persons in a favorable way. So that said, the third strategy was, of course, looking at decrim. So since 2004, when EcoGround started, our first foray into advocacy was to start educating and sensitizing. And we still continue to do that because it is very important that people, A, know about who they are and what they are, and they're able to stand up and say, hey, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm whatever. And you need to recognize that and respect that. So without us actually recognizing and respecting it within ourselves, it's difficult to get other people to do that. So the second, area was actually going around the country talking about LGBTIQ issues and getting people, parents, friends, other people, educators, everyone on the same page. So this has led to what, we have come this far so far. So in 2014, I sat down with Human Dignity Trust. And we decided the best way to do this was to go through the United Nations. Since Nick Toonan had already created a precedent in the UN, we decided to go to, rather than the HRC, we decided to, or the ICCPR, we decided to go through CEDAW because in Sri Lanka, it's one of few countries, like 40 odd countries, that criminalizes same-sex relationships between women as well. So that's where we decided we will take this to the CEDAW committee. And it took 4 years to actually formulate the case, put it together. Obviously, they're working in UK, I'm in Sri Lanka. We are running about doing all our own things at that time. So, it took that long, 4 years, to actually file the case in 2018. And this year in March, they ruled in favor of me. So I'm really happy about that. Thank you. I'm really happy about that because it also influences, other countries who criminalize, same-sex relationships between women. It is something that is now entrenched in the UN and it cannot be, shifted. Obviously, the state of Sri Lanka had until October to reply to this, but I'm sure they had other things to worry about, like we don't have any money. Okay, now what do we do? There's no petrol, there's no gas, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of hardship in Sri Lanka at the moment. But in the course of all of this, last year, we filed a case against the police. It was the first fundamental right case at the Court of Appeal against the police, and highlighting the fact that the police employed or engaged a person with very little psychiatric or mental health backgrounds to do trainings at the police academy and various other places within the police force, and talking to them how harmful the LGBT community is to Sri Lanka, how they are polluting our kids, how they are treating our children, and so on and so forth. At one time, and of course, she had the nerve to put this on YouTube. That's how we managed to get all the evidence. Yeah. So we filed a case against this woman and the police. And it has taken almost 1 year now, September of last year till now. But one good thing has come out of it. Just a few days ago, the Inspector General of Police had a meeting, a formal meeting with the LGBTIQ community along with the Ministry of Women and Children. And he apologized to the LGBTIQ community for the police mistreating and actually abusing the LGBTIQ community members, because the police are the biggest perpetrators of violence and unlawful arrests and all kinds of awful things that happen to the LGBTIQ community is done by the police. And the second, of course, is from families. So this has been a huge breakthrough. Just a few months ago as well, a private member's bill was put forth in Parliament to decriminalize homosexuality. So all of a sudden, there's been a lot of movement in the last few years. I can't attribute it only to the CEDAW case, but I want to pat myself on the back and say yes. But I think it has helped, especially since Sri Lanka is going for major donors like the IMF and the Asian Development Bank and various countries and so on and so forth. I think they are looking at the fact that 138 years later, we're still using old British colonial laws to make LGBTIQ lives miserable in Sri Lanka. And plus also in the last few years, there has been an influx of positive media towards the LGBTIQ community. And again, I would like to pat my organization on the back because we've been doing a lot of media sensitizing. We've been doing a lot of media campaigning. And on top of all of that, the number of LGBTIQ organizations has grown. In 2015, we were the only ones. Now there are several all across the country. Most of them worked at Equal Ground. So I'm really proud of that as well. So I put out a new generation of activists to work on behalf of the LGBTIQ community. So these kinds of litigations are really very, very important. I just wanted to mention that at our UPR in 2017 at the UN, we quoted a Supreme Court, what did I say? A gay couple who were incarcerated for having sex in the back of a van and was caught by the police. Took the case to the Supreme Court, and the judge actually basically said, it is unfortunate that we can't, make a decision about this positively, although we understand that this is a ridiculous, and these are in my words, not their words. It's a ridiculous thing, but we are going to rule in favor of, not in favor of the litigant, but to say that it's okay, you've time served and that's it, because this law is not, a law that is effective. And since you can't change it in the Supreme Court even because of the savings law clause, their hands are tied. They have to go with the law. So things are changing slowly. And I hope that maybe by next year, if I'm here next year, I'll say we have decriminalized in Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. I mean, in preparation for this, I looked up a little bit and I wanted to see, because I have, I think we all have a feeling, okay, there's been actually quite, it's not everything is going in the right direction. There are countries that are actually introducing criminalization of various forms. But in 2008, there were 86 countries that criminalized same-sex relations. And now we can argue about the exact number, but we're around 65. So I think, at least from my perspective, I think that's quite, it's quite a good and critical shift that we have been able to see. I wanted to ask, and any one of you who want to take this question can do so. Clearly building alliances with many other groups outside of the LGBTIQ movement itself is critical. Where do you think you have found sort of unexpected support? And are there groups or institutions that you thought would be supportive that haven't been?
So thanks, Maria. I think that, this is not something the LGBT community can do alone. It's been really clear in Namibia that we needed to, first of all, even within our advocacy as civil society, find collaboration and collaborative movements. So we needed to speak to the movement of people living with HIV. We needed to speak to the women's sector. We needed to speak to people with disabilities. So we needed to go across the civil society sector for people to first understand what is it that we are asking for. We have to remember that our opposition is always well-funded, well-organized, and they've really gotten to most of the places that we haven't gotten to, right? And they have spoken about special rights. They have spoken about us being a danger to children, etc., etc. Everybody knows the story. And so these alliances across civil society are really important because they are in spaces where we sometimes are not, and them knowing our struggles, them knowing our asks and demands, make it easier for them to counter what our opposition may bring on the table in those spaces. So that's really important. So the Diversity Alliance of Namibia, the collaboration between feminists, sex workers, and LGBTI groups was really important to first get this national strategy and then to start the action of review of the current laws as well as potential reform. Funding obviously is really, really important because Namibia is an upper middle income country. And so we don't really qualify for much of the development aid that is out there. And so speaking to specific donors, so in this instance, we were really fortunate to be able to be working with the Human Dignity Trust as well as the Kaleidoscope Trust, both British funded, and flowing from the what I want to call a partial excuse of the then Prime Minister for exporting these unfair laws to their colonies back then. We also, fortunately, the project that I'm working on is free to be made. It's funded by HEVOS, thanks to the Dutch government again, which really brings together most of the LGBT organizations, but actually looks at things like economic strengthening, which have really created thinking around, well, what if we get rid of the sodomy law and the Unnatural Sexual Offences Act? This is still a low bar, right? It's just removing a law that shouldn't have been there, but there are still a lot of cases for equity that we need to fight for in labor, for example, recognition of LGBT families and children, etc., etc. And so initiatives like this bring together different thinking beyond the sodomy law, beyond removing the colonial legislation. And one of the important initiatives is the Inclusive Governance Initiative, that is a UNDP initiative together with Positive Vibes. And this brings together government officials and civil society to speak about the issue of LGBT rights or the rights of LGBT people. And I think it's important because we are then able to sit across the table with government officials of different ministries and departments to really see where are the opportunities for change, and them understanding where we're coming from, us understanding the difficulties they have, even if they are open-minded government officials, that they have to work within a government that's often not very progressive.
Yeah, Rosanna.
Yeah, I wanted to say that one of the most, I think, important allies that we have formed is with the business community, because we felt, very much that, money talks, right? At the end of the day, and the business community has a lot of power within our country in particular. So we started off in 2015, basically sensitizing and educating over 14,000 staff of this very huge conglomerate called John Keel's Holdings. And to this date, they are very much visible and involved in gay rights in Sri Lanka. Now we have our D&I program has covered more than 50 organizations and probably more than 25,000 employees. But and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But the business community is so important as allies on this road. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to the next question. I'm going to direct this to you, Kenita. I mean, I'm not going to say if fair, but when decriminalization happens across the region, what will change for LGBTIQ people?
Wow. I think when we look at decriminalizing, I mean, this is just one section. And so what it does, it gives LGBT persons within the justice system where this is not a law that can be used as an excuse for not allowing due process. And, you know, having 3 countries within the 5 countries that ECAID has brought cases to, have the courts decided that these laws are unconstitutional, it now looks at the protections that needs to now be in those, you know, what are the protections that we need now? Now that those laws are unconstitutional, is the Constitution written in a manner that allows protection? And this does not just stand within the justice system. I mean, if we all have to agree, most of our justice systems need to throw out, because then it still comes on the same foundation of the colonial standings. So how do you bring a new constitution if you're not looking at revamping the entire system? But I think in terms of short, we are also looking at, as a people, how are you really creating access? So with access, we are looking at how we are training healthcare professionals, teachers, police officers, and this is something that's continuous. But the biggest partners that we get and the allies that we actually need is the media, because they can do harm and they can do good with just one story. So I think when we look at what we are building and how we are building the allyship, I think we are really pulling in media personnel to continuously sensitize them. And for some of us where in-country support is not necessarily present consistently, especially if what we are doing, the global family is extremely important in terms of how you connect those dots. So ECAID is 26 organizations, not 26 LGBT organizations, it's 26 organizations set out because it's women, girls, youth, climate change, women farmers. We are looking at food security, environmental justice, climate justice. And so when you take that justice portfolio, you are building something beyond just LGBT. And the strategy is finding the commonality amongst all the threads that allow you to push forward on that.
I remember a conversation I had with a government official probably 15 years ago, who was very focused on decriminalization and really wanted that to be sort of the one focus of his government's support. And in that conversation, it was very hard to get across anything besides sort of the counting of the countries. And I think that, I mean, all 3 of you really demonstrate in the way that you talk about it, that decriminalization is just one thing. It's not the only thing. When you have it, it's not, things are not done, and it's not done in isolation. And I think that really speaks to sort of the success that we have seen in multiple countries over the last several years. We're going to do a couple of questions. So I don't know if someone is monitoring the chat, if we have a question from the chat, and if someone could help me with a microphone.
I'm good.
No, I think you may need to speak into the microphone to capture the sound for the.
The question is, my husband and I are many same-sex couples petitioning the Supreme Court of India for recognition of our marriage. This is 4 years after the country decriminalized homosexuality by repealing Section 377. I'm concerned that decriminalization and marriage equality are treated as 2 separate policy objectives by both government officials and by advocates. In the United States, we had a 13-year difference between Lawrence, the sodomy case, and Obergefell, the marriage equality case. In Singapore, the excitement over decriminalization was tempered by the government doubling down on a heteronormative definition of marriage. So, my question is this: what are the legal and messaging tactics that are effective in changing hearts, minds, and laws when it comes to both same-sex sex and same-sex marriage as a package deal? Or do you believe that these should be consecutive efforts?
Okay, great. Let's see if there is one more question.
Thank you so much. This is amazing as usual. My question is whether you think there are international movements to have a treaty on queer rights? And if so, would that be helpful for the decriminalization and the general LGBT plus movement?
Thank you so much. I think we're going to go to the panelists to respond to these two pretty broad and hard questions. I don't think we're going to see a resolution or agreement here, but let's get some responses as we're wrapping up this panel. Kenita, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that different countries have different strategies in thinking about whether they can have a marriage conversation whilst having a decriminalization conversation. Strategically, there are places and ways within constitutional law where you can look at hammering down the decrim whilst doing marriage equality. It's all about how those laws are actually written and whether you actually need a specific strategy to actually deal with marriage. The Caribbean, I mean, taken from the Caribbean, it's one where we have made these two topics in two different strands because we understand the rhetoric in the region, how religious the region is, and how the churches have been using marriage and natural family as a way to hammer down at LGBT persons. And so it is not a one size fit all. It is really about country context. And it's also about what activists who are at the front line sees as a priority, because do we have persons who are interested in marriage, who got married, who wants to do this? It's not just you saying that you want to bring this. It's a matter of, do you have the people to take it forward? And so I think in some countries, there are two threads, they are one. When I look at some of the international treaties and bodies, the first thing I ask is, what's the obligation of state? It's one thing to have a number of those kind of thing out there, but how does international connect with domestic? And how does it affect the lives of the individuals that we are serving? So many of those tend to be kind of out there, but when my government sign it, does it really have an impact on my life? Or the person who just lost a job because the labor law does not apply? Or the person who have been put out of housing because the tenancy laws allow tenants to have that level of discrimination. So I always think about, it can be great, and we see our governments who sign things out there and they come out like they're champions. But then when we look inwardly, it's not so. I mean, we are sitting in a country that's famous for it, you know? So I think that when we look at the work that we are doing, we have to ask ourselves a few questions about, who are we doing it for? What are we doing it for? And what is the thing that we're really looking to achieve? And for me, the achievement of what we are looking for, whether it was Antigua, St. Kitts, or Barbados who just said it is unconstitutional to have those laws, at the bottom of this is, and in 2018, OSF and ARCUS said this was a best practice based on how we framed it. You cannot have litigation in isolation. The prong approach. Litigation is one thing. Communications and campaigns, how you're changing hearts and minds, is continuously important. The advocacy and policy work that you continue to do on the other end of this is also important. Security, self, litigants, lawyers, family, community. We are not here to lose anybody. So we need to make sure everybody is continuously safe. And the last prong, which is the fifth one, what is the well-being that is put in place also for persons who are in this? It's interesting, I'm also a litigant in St. Lucia, but I don't always call myself a litigant because people just see me as the person who is moving all the pieces across all the countries. But it is difficult sitting in my position and thinking about every other litigant being safe, which most times I don't put myself in that. Because for me, safety for me comes first now.
Thank you, Kanita. Friedel and then Rosanna.
Yeah, thanks. Hard question. I didn't get the second one, but I'll stick to the first one. So, a case in point in Namibia, we actually really decided on a clean strategy that we wanted to do this consequentially. We tried in the strategy to avoid marriage, really touching on marriage at all, because what we found was that this area was loaded. It was real. There was a lot of pushback, especially from the religious sector in our country. When you just mentioned the word marriage, you actually really get, you don't move very far with your advocacy. And in our discussions, in our dialogues with the church leaders, it was really important. It became important that the word itself was loaded, because when we spoke to them about civil unions, they were like, "Yeah, we can talk to you." But once we said marriage, it was really all these biblical connotations and other things that you really bring to the conversation that you don't really want to. And so, as a result, we had decided on a very clean strategy. We were just going to decriminalize and then do everything else afterwards. But, you know, in life, it doesn't happen that way, right? So even though we had this clean strategy, we had citizens bring on action on surrogacy and recognition of the citizenship of the twins, on domicile, which is really marriage that is concluded in Germany, in South Africa, in Mexico, that really is asking government to recognize these marriages. We had a case and a win where Mercedes, a trans woman, actually won against the police for brutality. And so, you know, in the end, I believe that, you know, life will happen, and that as advocates, as activists, we need to be on our feet and work with it. I think what is really important now is to support those other cases that may be beyond decriminalization, that may be for recognition, and to find a way in which we weave it into our strategy going forward for Namibia.
Thank you so much. Rosanna.
Well, I have to agree with both Faisal and Kenita, because when we were looking at you know, the decriminalization process in Sri Lanka, definitely we were not thinking about, you know, asking for gay marriage or any of these things, because we thought that would cloud the judgment there. And basically, you know, we had to make sure that we sensitized people to what the LGBTIQ community is all about, because even up to this date, you know, the first thing that comes to their head is, oh, it's only about sex, yeah, or they're pedophiles. These are the things that are going on in their head. So if you thought about thinking of putting marriage into that whole thing, then it was going to actually derail our you know, decriminalization push. So yes, we are thinking, and also Sri Lanka has a very convoluted legal system, in the sense that there are 3 or 4 different laws in place. One is the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Acts, Muslim law. Then we have Tesavalamur law from the north. We have Kandyan law. So, you know, all these things, they are local laws as well as laws that are brought by the British. So it's a bit, you know, confusing and you know, difficult to negotiate sometimes. But so as far as the treaty bodies and making a treaty about all of these things, well, Sri Lanka signs to, you know, every single treaty, every single thing that's going internationally. But when they come home, they just toss everything and carry on like nothing happened. Yeah. So, I mean, UPR, I was just thinking about it a couple of months back, because Sri Lanka's periodic review is up for review. And I'm thinking, you know, I did this in 2008. I did this in 2017. I'm now doing this in 2022. It's the same thing. Everybody has asked to decriminalize, to do this and put in, you know, provisions of, you know, non-discrimination and this and that and the other thing. And they say, oh, yeah, but the Constitution says that all are born equal. So it's okay, it's in the Constitution. But of course, it doesn't apply to us. Yeah, the Constitution doesn't apply to us. So they will sign everything. I mean, it is because they signed the optional protocol for CEDAW that I was able to bring that case in. Yeah. So they've signed everything, you know, and said, yes, yes, yeah, we are okay with that. Yeah, we will do that. But when it comes to actually, you know, implementing or making changes, nothing has been done. Nothing. So, you know, countries such as ours, as you know, it takes a long time for them to think of themselves as losing control of the people by signing any kind of human rights instrument or giving people their rights. Governments have been totally dictatorial in that sense and have always chosen to protect themselves rather than the people. So asking for change, even at a treaty level or UN level, we can keep doing it. We do it because we need to do it, and we need to highlight, you know, the abuses and the inequalities. But back home, most human rights, you know, activists who have complained against the government at the UN are targeted. So.
Thank you, Rosanna. Kenita, you wanted 1 minute to say something?
Well, pretty much 1 second. I just want to say thank you to every single person who have supported ECAID in bringing those cases. And although we were able to give you Antigua and Barbuda decision in July, St. Kitts and Nevis in August, and December, we're giving you Barbados unconstitutional as of today.
That is amazing. We're going to conclude this panel discussion. We're not done with these topics. We will keep talking about them. We'll keep collaborating. We'll keep following as the number of countries that criminalize same-sex relations will continue to go down. And we're going to fight whatever and do whatever we can in the countries that are trying to introduce any kind of criminalization. Let's give a warm hand of applause to our panel. Thank you so much.